We want to welcome Steve Beck, who is a retired director of the Sacramento Historical Society and was the historian, archivist, and educational programming director at Sutter's Fort from 1998 to 2018. Using dozens of rare photographs and maps, he will grace us with tales of John Sutter, who in 1839 introduced and established Western civilization in the Sacramento Valley of Mexican California. It is my pleasure to introduce Steve Beck.
Hey, thank you very much, Michelle. And I want to thank everyone in the Renaissance Society for inviting me into your computer today to share a little bit of California, or at least Sacramento Valley's earliest written history. And, I'm not really going to create more questions in your mind than I'm going to answer today. The history of the Sacramento Valley is complex and convoluted. And, we talk about the United States being a melting pot. Well, I can assure you that early California was a melting cauldron. Probably no place on earth in such a small population did a greater diversity of people exist. First of all, the most common people in the population when John Sutter arrived in 1839 were the California Indians. Quite literally thousands of them. Many had been Christianized and brought into the mission system. Many of those had been enslaved. Others had been enslaved and put into the rancho system. And yet you had the free, or as the term went at that time, the wild Indians, who were still existing and living as their families had lived for hundreds of years. And throw into that mix the ones who did not want to be part of the Christian system and who escaped to live among the wild Indians. And imagine the tales that they brought with them and the situation that it created for people settling in the valley at that time. Plus the population itself, the Western population, was diverse. I mean, first of all, this was part of New Spain, but then in 1821, something happened that all of a sudden they're not Spanish anymore. Now they're Mexican. And into this, you bring expatriates from all over the world that are coming to live in California because they either want to start a new life, they're escaping an old life, or for whatever reason, they've end up on the edge of civilization. A lot of those were people of African descent. Slavery was made illegal in the Caribbean, largely in 1834. And many of those people found their way to the frontier, and the frontier in North America was California. It was the ends of the earth and was really not known around the rest of the world. And then into this comes a Swiss German adventurer and entrepreneur, John Sutter, and things are going to change rapidly for the Sacramento Valley. I'm going to introduce you to, through pictures, to some of those changes and to some of the people that were involved in what's going to happen. And that's why we're going to talk about the real John Sutter and his world, from Indians to bear flaggers. And let's see. Now, Sutter built a complex. We now call it Sutter's Fort. In its time, it was really known as Nueva Helvetia, or New Switzerland. Sutter had given his settlement a European identity because he was here to make money. He wanted to attract people to live on his land. The quote that you see on your screen right now, and I am going to read it, so don't try to strain your eyes if you're having trouble with that, but it's something I first saw about 40 years ago. It's from a series of documents, or a portmanteau of documents, known as the Kern Papers, which were the largest source of history we have for the American occupation period in California. But the foreword, Seymour Dunbar, a historian, writes, "Among all the famous places of the earth, whereat have been enacted dramas whose influence upon the affairs of men transcends definition, there are perhaps a dozen spots that stand apart as a supreme group, whose renown seems destined to defy the ages. To that group belongs the Forum at Rome, the Acropolis at Athens, Stratford-on-Avon, Galileo's Observatory, Plymouth Rock, Newton's study, the field at Waterloo, and Independence Hall. To that group belongs Sutter's Fort. For all the life of all people and all nations has been profoundly affected by things that found their origin within its walls." Well, I got to tell you, the first time I read that, I thought, what a bunch of malarkey that is. I mean, this little place that's right down in the center of Midtown, how could it have influenced the lives of all people on all Earth? But for 40 years, I began studying it. I read as much as I could that was written. I listened to what I could about the stories that there were, and it gave me an entirely new opinion of what life was like in California, how it became what it was, and the role that this guy Sutter, you know, there's over 250 different entities named for Sutter, from a county to 3 cities to a hospital or a health care service, schools, a gentleman's business club. He influenced many things that happened within what is known as the Sacramento Valley. Now, Sutter himself was born in 1803 into a middle-class family. This is a picture of his house. It still survives in the village of Kandern in what is now a part of Germany. But when Sutter was born, this was the Grand Duchy of Baden, ruled by a Grand Duke. And I know what you're thinking. You're looking at that and you're going, middle class. 1803. My God, that looks like a pretty nice middle class home. Well, the only part that's a home is that little A-frame off to your right. The rest of that building, the main building in the front, but the little chalet thing off to the right with the 3 windows, that is the house. The rest of it's a paper factory. His father, his grandfather were managers of this paper factory, and that's the life into which Sutter was born, not Switzerland, as he later identified himself, and where he did move as a businessman, but into Kandern in the Grand Duchy of Baden. And he grew up between 1803 and 1815, the formative years, when he's 12 years old. These are the Napoleonic era, when soldiers are marching across the only bridge across the Rhine River for 100 miles in either direction. And he sees both the Napoleon's army as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire's army. And look at those guys. Man, I'll tell you, when I was a 12-year-old boy, I think I'd have probably liked to look like some of these. And Sutter gets it in his head that he wants to be a soldier, because remember the time period, the early 19th century. Soldiers have respect, soldiers have honor, soldiers are a way to move yourself through the social system. And of course, at this time, Europe was incredibly fragmented. Hard to look at this map and recognize it as Europe. I mean, look, there's the Empire of Austria, the Kingdom of France and Navarre, the Kingdom of Prussia. What do you see that's a sense pattern here? Every one of these is a kingdom or a grand duchy or a principality or a dukedom. This was Western feudalism in its dying hour before Bismarck unites Germany and everything. You can see Baden is the brown piece kind of in the center of your screen. And Sutter went to school in the little yellow piece of Switzerland. It was the Principality of Neuchâtel. And at the time, it was one of the finest military schools in all of Europe. How Sutter's parents afforded to send him there, I could not tell you. But he went off to military school. And by the time he reached California, Sutter knew how to speak and write 4 different languages, including German, French, English, and Spanish. He also learns a bit of Russian while he's here. Here's our man, at least how he looked in a pencil drawing that was done in 1839 in Hawaii. There are not any real photographs of Sutter as a young man, but you notice he does look dashing. He has the fancy mustache. He was described as having blonde hair, bluish eyes, and he's in a fancy uniform here because Sutter identified himself as being a soldier because he had gone to military school. But most of you history buffs know that in 1815, when Sutter was 12 years old, Napoleon was beaten at the Battle of Waterloo. And with the defeat of Napoleon, Europe fragmented back much to what it had been in the Middle Ages. And all of a sudden, the big standing armies were dissolved. All the money that had been going to support those standing armies no longer went to hire soldiers to be a part of those armies, so that only the sons of the aristocracy became officers within the existing armies. Sons of the middle class, some of them got to become preachers. Some of them got to become businessmen, but there was very little opportunity. And thousands of European males are looking for a way to support themselves and support their families. And in Sutter's case, in 1824, he got married. By 1834, he had 5 children. Now, one of those children died in infancy, which of course was very common in that era. But Sutter's got a wife and 4 children and no job. Not really anyway. He tries to open a dry goods business. Fortunately, his mother-in-law does have some money. She invests in his dry goods business, and he's able to make a go of it for a while, but it's not the kind of life he wants. He wants something fancier for himself, for his wife, Anna, and for his children. So Sutter ostensibly borrows about 25,000 francs or 7,000 American dollars to put back into that dry goods business. But and a lot of you I know already have heard Sutter was a debtor. Well, that's part of his later life. Where farmers live in debt. You borrow against your crop, then you hope your yield is enough to pay off all your debts and make a little money on the side. Sutter, though, at this time is not a debtor. Sutter's probably a thief at this time because he puts that $7,000 into a money belt and hightails it for the New World. His wife, Anna, actually helps him get a passport. Now, some of you who know Sutter are saying, oh, no, wait a minute. There was a warrant for his arrest for debting. Well, yes, there was, but it was after he had left and after Anna had helped him get all the way to Le Havre to take a ship to the New World. Now, he didn't take a regular route to the New World. We're going to talk about this rather circuitous route he takes. But once he does get to the New World, the first place he heads, well, he lands in New York, but then he heads to the frontier. The picture you see on your screen now is the Santa Fe Trail. Now, that Santa Fe trade was originally created in about 1825, but Sutter didn't become a part of it until about 1835 when he finally makes his way to Missouri. Now, these people would take manufactured goods down into Mexico, now New Mexico, Santa Fe, and there they would exchange those for raw materials such as furs and gold and turquoise and silver. And some people made great money off of it. Some people traded junk. But it was during this part of his trade that Sutter learned about California. He met trappers who had been to California. He heard about the lakes and the rivers teeming with otter and beaver. And this time, pelts were what was making the American West survive. It's how people made money. And he hears about that and the free availability of land and the fact that there's very little government. He meets Kit Carson, he meets Joe Walker, he meets men that are very important in the trapping industry, and it entices him to find a way to get to California. Well, California is the end of the earth. No one goes to California, remember? So Sutter is in that place on your map in the center called Westport. Well, you know what? There are some people who go to California. They're the Yankee trading vessels. It's vessels that leave New York. They travel all the way around the tip of South America. They go to Hawaii because you have to go through Hawaii to get to the Pacific coast. At least it's the fastest way. That way you don't fight the longshore current as you're going across the equator and up the coast of North America. You can go to Hawaii and then catch the westerlies to get back to California. The Yankee trading ships would go up and down the coast of California for a couple of years, trading manufactured goods for hide and tallow. Many of you have probably read 2 Years Before the Mask. That deals with that hide and tallow trade. So Sutter knows that somebody goes to California, but he can't get a ship. Now he's in the middle of the United States, or what's going to become the United States. He's in Missouri. So he joins up with a fur trapping expedition headed to the great last rendezvous of trappers in 1838 in the Wind River Mountains, Rocky Mountains. He gets there, he meets Kit Carson again. He buys a young Indian guide from Kit Carson, and that young Indian guide, a boy estimated to be about 12 years old, takes Sutter and a group of other men overland all the way to the Pacific coast to Fort Vancouver, the headquarters of the Hudson Bay Company on the western side of Canada, or what is then still part of New Canada and part of the uncontrolled region in the Pacific Northwest that is jointly held by the United States, by Russia, by England, everyone. It is the Wild West. Sutter gets there. He asked about, how do I get to California? And they said, you know what? Nobody goes to California. We don't even go to California anymore. The Indians along the frontier are too hostile. It's not worth it to go down there to get the furs. But they remind him the Yankee traders go there. So if you can get to Hawaii, Sutter, oh, we've got an office in Hawaii and a ship sailing there. So Sutter takes a ship from Fort Vancouver to Hawaii. Now he's stuck in Hawaii because the American boat that's going to be sailing up and down the coast, he misses by about 2 weeks. This is how Honolulu looked when Sutter was there in about 1838. It's a bustling port. You don't go to hell or heaven in the Pacific without going through Honolulu at this time. Sutter is there about 8 weeks. He meets businessmen. He identifies himself as a businessman himself. He also writes some articles that are still preserved in the Honolulu newspaper at that time. He defends the French actions at the Battle of Grenoble. He even claims to have been at the Battle of Grenoble. John Sutter was 10 when the Battle of Grenoble took place. I doubt he was there. And remember the uniform? And he is defending himself as being part of the French army. As a matter of fact, he identifies himself as being in the Swiss Guard, the guys that dress in the fancy uniforms and guard the Pope. He's identifying himself as being part of the Swiss Guard of Charles X. Why would he do that? Well, if you're going to be going cross country, and your only places you're going to be stopping are Fort Vancouver and Fort Hall and Fort Lewis and all the other little fort trading posts along the way, it's a lot better to walk into that fort and be Captain John Sutter of the Swiss Guard than it is to be John Sutter, broke dry goods salesman. So essentially, Sutter goes to a thrift store in Westport, drapes a sword on his side, and becomes Captain John Sutter, an identity he did not there before have. This is King Kamehameha of Hawaii. Sutter becomes friends with him. In fact, this man, the King Kamehameha III, gives Sutter 10 Hawaiians. Well, it doesn't give. He allows 10 of his people to travel with Sutter of their own volition. There are 8 men and 2 women. Sutter has to pay them the same standard contract that's been used to take Hawaiis to work in the lumber industry of Oregon at this time. He's to pay them $10 a month for their services each. At the end of 1 year, they have the option of returning to Hawaii at Sutter's expense or staying with Sutter. For whatever it's worth, we do not know of any that returned to Hawaii. Most of them stayed in California, and of course, the gold rush is going to play into that. Of course, Sutter's stuck there in Hawaii. Let's go back let's leave on this. Sutter's stuck there in Hawaii. How's he going to get to California if the American ship is left? Well, he is so impressive to the businessmen of Honolulu that they actually purchased an abandoned ship in Honolulu Harbor. They completely outfit it. They put all the necessary crew and all the necessary trading goods in it to send it to North America, except they don't send it to California because no one goes to California. And the Mexican trade, while they're trying to make it more free, is not going to be profitable. Instead, they send it to Fort Sitka, Alaska. That's what's on your screen today. This is the North American headquarters of the Russian American Fur Company. So essentially a piece of Russia in North America. While Sutter's there, he becomes friends with the Governor Rothschild, who's the head of the Russian American Fur Company at that time, a man named Kosmitinoff. He creates a relationship with the Russians that lasts the entire time that he's in North America, or at least when he's living on the frontier of California. But how's he going to get to California? Well, just like as it happened in Honolulu, either the people of Sitka hated him or liked him so much that they actually gave him a ship take our ship, Sutter, if you want to get to California. So Sutter is going to sail on a Russian vessel from Sitka to California. He has three conditions. One, he has to stop at Fort Ross, their fort on the coast of California, to drop off supplies. He then has to sail into the Mexican capital of Monterey to unload all the goods, sell the goods, pay the customs duties on those goods, and then send the ship back to Sitka. And this is where we find Sutter in 1839, except Sutter doesn't follow instructions very well. After stopping at Ross, he pulls into San Francisco Bay. This city that you see in the sand hills behind here is what we now call San Francisco. At this time, it was known as Yerba Buena, the village of Yerba Buena. You know, I've always thought that was a much better name for San Francisco. Good herb, but you know, child of the 60s. So, but this is San Francisco, Yerba Buena, as it looked in about the time Sutter was there in 1839. A few ships are there. Sutter is told you can't land here. It's not a port of entry. He's given 48 hours to take on water and wood and then to go to the capital. But it's during this time that Sutter, with letters of reference, letters of recommendation, and most importantly, letters of credit from the businessmen of Honolulu, who are the wholesalers for the businessmen of California, that Sutter is able to make friends that he's going to keep this entire time. In fact, he buys 2,500 head of cattle. He's on a ship. He has no place to put them. He doesn't even know if he has any land. He's here to ask for free land that he doesn't know if they're going to give him, but he's purchased with credit 2,500 head of cattle. This is the city of Monterey. This is how it looked in about 1846, but it must have looked very similar when Sutter arrived in July of 1839. But Sutter, remember, this is the guy who's created an identity for himself. So before he sails around this point up there by Santa Cruz, he sends ahead a whaleboat with an emissary announcing to the entire city, to the governor, to the customs house, the arrival of Captain John Sutter of the Swiss Guard. And they're going to have a big party on his ship that night. And his ship, of course, it's the Russian ship, but everyone in the town is invited. So before this man has ever set foot within this California state, or what's going to be the capital of Mexican California, he's already being lauded by all the people of the town on how important he is and what a great officer he is and what a hero he can become. So he has created an identity for himself. The man on the screen is Juan Alvarado. This is the governor of Mexican California at this time. This is now 1839. This is the man that John Sutter is going to have to ask for property. And when Sutter goes to him and says, "Hey, I hear you're giving out free land," he says, "No, not anymore. We used to give out free land, but we don't do that anymore. We have to subdivide it among our children because there isn't enough to go around." And it's during this time that Sutter says, "You know, I don't want your land. I know where you've settled. I want land in the interior. I've heard about something called the Sacramento River, and I want to go along the Sacramento River and look for a settlement there." Well, Alvarado says he has to discuss it with the junta or with the other members of the political entity there in the Mexican capital. After a night or two of discussing it, they go back to Sutter and said, "Okay, Sutter, if you want to live here so badly, here's the conditions. You can go into the interior. You have to live there for 1 year, and then you can find the land you want. After you've lived there 1 year, you need to come back here, and we will give you the largest land grant available under Mexican law, 11 square leagues, almost 75 square miles, essentially everything from the Cosumnes River to where Yuba City, Marysville is today. And all you got to do is be able to live there." Sounds like a great deal, doesn't it? The Mexicans thought Sutter could never succeed because every time they had tried, they had failed. They thought that either the Indians would kill him, so what, or chase him off. We've already told him there's no other land. Or three, maybe he does build a small farm and then the Indians go steal his stuff instead of theirs. One thing they never knew is that Sutter would succeed in making some type of peace agreement with the Indians and utilize the Indians in what he was going to accomplish in the Central Valley. And this is how the Indians would have looked at this time. This is a standard Maidu village. The three peaks you see in the background, then known as Los Tres Picos, those are the Sutter Buttes today. But basically, this was a society that lived largely without any kind of warfare, at least in the Sacramento Valley. I'm not talking about the Modoc Plateau or the Colorado River. This is where everybody has enough to eat. Everybody has a place to stay. So everybody, for most intents and purposes, is living in peace, and the population is huge. Quite possibly the largest hunting and gathering population in the history of humanity is what, at least the most densely populated hunting and gathering society is, who lived in the Sacramento Valley when Sutter arrived in August of 1839. Now, this is A.L. Kroeber's map that was done in about 1900. And on this, you can see the subdivisions that Kroeber, the first chair of anthropology at UC Berkeley, had for the California Indians. He subdivides them 96 different times, but you can subdivide them 196 different times and not equal the diversity of the California Indians. So what happened to these Indians if they're so dense? Why were they? How did Sutter accomplish what he accomplished? Some of them, had already adopted the mission system. They wanted to move in. They wanted to wear clothes. They wanted to have copper cooking pots, steel knives, things like that. And it was a lot easier to pray to one god than it was to pray to a bunch of gods. But not all of them liked it by any means. As a matter of fact, the guys in the bottom right of this screen, you can see they're not having much fun at all. Some of the missions became slave camps. Almost all of the ranchos were slave camps. Certainly men like Salvador Vallejo went out and rounded up Indians for the express purpose of bringing them back to his ranch to be nothing more than slaves. So how is Sutter going to accomplish this? Well, Sutter hires a man to take him up the river. Now, this is a very blurry map of what California looked like when Sutter's here in 39. And you'll notice all those dots are along the coast. The only development the Spanish and Mexicans had done was simply coastal development. The only thing on the interior, and it's not until 1840, is going to be Sutter's fort. Here's Sutter as a businessman. This is a painting that was done of him in 1850, an oil painting. Here's my favorite picture of John Sutter, and no doubt his favorite too. Now here, he's not in that uniform that he's picked up. Instead, this is a major general in the California militia. This was done by a man named Jewett. It was painted in 1851, at the same time Sutter became a major general. Sutter probably loved the pomp that went along with having this kind of position. And as a matter of fact, this picture is about as big as any wall that's in your house. It's huge. It's now stored in a warehouse out by McClellan Air Force Base, but it once hung in the assembly chambers of the California State Assembly until he was replaced by Abraham Lincoln in 1911. So when California became a state, and up until they decided to have Lincoln replace Sutter, it was John Sutter who overlooked the People's Chamber, the assembly in California. Of course, the only industry that existed in California at this time, as we learned from Dana, is the hide and tallow trade. Sutter has his 2,500 head of cattle. He now needs to find a place to put them. So he maps out, and a man named Jean-Jacques Viager, one of the expatriates from France, maps out an area. You can see that that's the Sacramento River, that's the single line, meets the Feather River. The Sacramento River goes off to the left. The Feather River goes up to the right, and he maps out New Helvetia, or New Switzerland. This is going to be Sutter's community, and he gives it a European identity to attract Europeans. So, why did John Sutter succeed at building a permanent settlement? Obviously, Sutter's fort is still here today. That building in the middle of the fort is the original building. 70% of the bricks and 55% of the wood are the original structures built in 1840. Other people had been trying and failing since 1806 The first guy was Jose Gabriel Moraga. He comes in with the Spanish army. He's got some cannon. He's got conquistadors. He's chasing escaped mission Indians. He's got three purposes: chase down those Indians and punish them. Punish any other Indians that have helped them escape or are housing them once they have escaped. And three, build a presidio or a mission within the interior to control the interior Indian population so that they don't poison the thought of all the rest of the Indians along the coast. Ever a Spanish mission or fort or Mexican mission or fort in the Central Valley? No, Moraga failed. But you know what? He did name many of the geographic features. He named the River de los Plumas, or the Feather River. He named the Rio de Sacramento, River of Sacrament, or he named the American River, but he didn't name it Rio de los Americanos. He named it Rio de los Llagos, River of Sorrow, because several of his soldiers were killed along its banks from an Indian attack. And essentially, Moraga was chased out of the Sacramento Valley in 1806, in 1808. Later, the American Fur Company comes in after other expeditions that also tried and failed. But in 1826, Jedediah Smith, famous mountain man, mostly famous because he survived a grizzly bear attack trying to chew his head off. It was something that influenced his picture the rest of his life because he was missing like a big part of his skull and everything. But he comes with the American Fur Company and camps about where Campus Commons and Sac State are across the river from where Sac State is today. He camps there the entire winter. He decides it would be a brilliant place to build a permanent settlement for fur trapping. He even comes back the next year trying to do it, but each time he's driven away or for whatever reason has to leave. Generally, it's attributed to the Indian population not welcoming him. Bigger people are going to try. Finally, so why did John Sutter succeed? Before we talk about the guy on the screen, why did Sutter succeed? Who was with Sutter? Did he have an army? Did he have rolling artillery? You know who was with John Sutter? John Sutter had himself, of course. He had three trappers. One was Irish, one was Italian, one was Belgian, and he had 10 Hawaiians. The 10 servants that he had picked up from King Kamehameha III, and two of those were women. One of them was of the Ali'i, or of the aristocracy of Hawaii. Her name was Manawiki, and no doubt Manawiki became Sutter's paramour. It's actually a great love story that can follow up with the Revolution of 1845 and Sutter to making sure that Manawiki is cared for in the event that he's killed. But yes, Sutter definitely has a relationship beyond his marital relationship with his wife, Anna, who's still back there in Europe. In fact, Sutter leaves his family for 16 years. They reunite, though, in January of 1850 and live together the rest of their lives. Sutter does finally start attracting people that, look, how did Sutter settle? He's only got 10 Hawaiians and 3 trappers. He's got 13 people in himself. And there are literally thousands of California Indians. As a matter of fact, the man who took him there was named William Heath Davis, wrote a great book about California called 60 Years in California. Davis, many years later, in rather Victorian language, recorded the landing, that there were hundreds of Indians lining the bank, that they were all armed and threatening, that Davis and his other crew felt that they might be attacked and they wanted to get the heck out of there. And Sutter said, no, I want to stay. They dropped Sutter on a sandbar at where the corner of 28th and C Street is today, along with his small entourage, a couple of small cannons he's bought on credit from the Hudson Bay Company. And when I say small, these are not anti-personnel weapons. They're signal guns meant to make a loud noise. Sutter's going to make his money trapping, and they're used as part of the trapping industry. Hence, they've come from Hudson Bay. But Sutter has these couple of small cannons and these few people, and he's left there on the bank. And Davis and his guys get the heck out of Dodge, or the heck out of Sacramento. The Indians come charging down the bank. Sutter takes and touches off those cannons that he's got loaded at this point, and boom, blows up some cottonwood trees along the edge of the river. He does not shoot the Indians. It is probably the first time that a white man has brought artillery into the interior and not used it upon them, as would have been with Morago or later with Mariano Vallejo and others who came into the interior. We don't know if that happened, but at least it gave pause that Sutter was able to negotiate with the big man of this region, a man named Benashi, to have them work together to create a settlement. In fact, it's the Indians who took Sutter to build his fort where they did. Sutter lived for a while along the river, but the mosquitoes were so awful that they couldn't survive there. They were living out of tents and out of huts that the Hawaiians had built of the local arunda grass. But they take Sutter to a place that's high and dry from where he can view both rivers. It's the Indians who settle Sutter there, and the Indians who then start working with Sutter to build what's going to become the first permanent Western settlement in the Sacramento Valley. So, you know, why did Sutter succeed? Was it just time? Were the Indians just ready to have access to Western material goods? Sutter was carrying trade supplies with him. He'd gotten them from the Russians. He had copper pots. He had medallions. He had beads. He had cloth. He had things like that. And maybe the Indians were just ready for Western trade. You know, although I don't think you can underestimate the importance of having 10 Hawaiians with you. I mean, remember, this is 1839. This is not Don Ho and his band who were traveling with John Sutter. These are middle of the 19th century Hawaiian islanders. And by golly, they would have been dark. They would have been tattooed. They would not have looked a whole lot different than the local population of Indian looked. And it's just supposition, but maybe that is what led to Sutter's success. But as Sutter built his settlement, people began to come west. This is John Bidwell. He tried to lead the first party of wagons overland to California. They came in 1841. Their wagons didn't make it, but everyone in that party made it except for one man who accidentally shot himself with his own gun. And that not only included John Bidwell, a 20-year-old school teacher, but included Nancy Kelsey, who was carrying her 3-year-old daughter from the time they abandoned those wagons just north of where the Great Salt Lake is today, all the way to California, and got pregnant on the trail as she traveled. One of the more amazing events in California history that's often overlooked. But once Sutter established his fort, it became a haven for every miscreant in the West. Now, this is a gold rush era map. Once the gold fields were established, people spread out. But before the people spread out to look for gold, Sutter's Fort was the destination of everyone coming to California. I'm going to show you just a couple of views of the fort. This is one that was done in 1849. That's a creek known as Burn Slough that actually flowed behind the north side of the fort, provided water for the distillery, which is the tall building you see down to the right of the picture there. This is another picture as it looked during the American occupation. You notice that big bare oak tree. So this was probably done in the winter. This is one that was done in the summer. Now, there's that big oak tree again. This is the most famous drawing ever done of Sutter's Fort. It was done by Joseph Warren Revere. Just happened to be the grandson of Paul Revere, unrelated to our story. But he was here with the United States Navy in 1846-47, and he drew this as a military establishment. But even still, the fort at this time is not even 5 years old, and you can see that south-facing wall has all of the enamel or all of the outside stucco is starting to decompose. But look at that tree. That tree is still there today. It's in the backyard of the California State Indian Museum, and it is over 350 years old. The corrals that you see off to the right in this picture, those extended all the way from Sutter's Fort at L Street down to about where P Street is today. Sutter had over 10,000 head of cattle, over 8,000 sheep, over 2,000 mules, over 1,500 horses. He had built a huge complex. This is a map that was done by, it's translated by Tucker, but this original map was done by a man who traveled through Sutter's Fort in 1846 named Kunzel, and he was the only one to identify what the interior of the fort looked like. And there you can see all those number 25s are the extensive corrals extending all the way down to P Street. And actually, the pond you see up at the top there is not really a pond. When he was there, the water was not flowing, but Sutter used to send men to dredge its headwaters up near where River Park is today to keep water flowing behind the fort, because that was your sewage system too. Fortunately, number 3, that little circle or bullseye in the middle, that was the well that provided their drinking water, not the pond or the creek in front of the fort. And how did Sutter accomplish all this in such a short period of time? You know, when the Wilkes expedition arrived, now that was the exploring expedition for the United States Navy, when they got there in 1841, they said that Sutter had fewer than 20 white men with him. Sutter had taken and made an army out of the Indians, not an army of laborers, literally an army. The defense of the fort, who guarded the gates, was provided by Indians. Sutter had drilled them in how to use the weaponry, and he never left the fort without an Indian guard of at least 5 lancers, usually 15, to accompany him wherever he went. But one reason he could accomplish so much with so little is because in 1841, remember that relationship he had with the Russians? He bought Fort Ross, the entire thing. Everything, the threshing floors, the 50 steel plows they had, the gates. You know, everyone always thought that Sutter's fort's gates were made of oak. And for many years, they were made of oak, even the reconstructed gates, because all of the woodwork within the original building is Quercus lobata, or valley oak. It wasn't until an archaeologist in the 1960s discovered the original post hole or gate hole for the front gate that they discovered the front gates were made of redwood. Sutter had simply taken Fort Ross apart and reassembled it as Sutter's fort. I'm just going to go through some guys right now. This is Pearson Redding. The city of Redding, of course, is built on his Cottonwood Ranch. Other things are named for him, but before all of that, he was a clerk and worked for John Sutter, a trapper as well. This is Peter Lassen, of course, Lassen County, Lassen National Park, Lassen Peak, all named for him. Before all that, he was a trapper and clerk for John Sutter. This is Sam Brannan. He became the first millionaire during the gold rush era. He came to California, a Mormon, on the ship Brooklyn with about 240 other Mormons. Their intent was to build the new Zion, which became Salt Lake, but they were going to build it in the Sacramento Valley. They built the city of New Hope even. Before all that, he worked with John Sutter. This is William Leidesdorff. He was the vice consul of the United States. He was probably the most important man in San Francisco at the time. What's unique is Mr. Leidesdorff is an African. Hard to tell from this picture because it would not be popular to be one, of course, in the middle of the 19th century. But his mother was a full-blooded Creole from the West Indies. His father was possibly half Dutch, half Creole, or maybe was even a full Dutch trader, although it's believed half and half. He was Sutter's nearest neighbor. He owned all the land to the west of Sutter, east of Sutter, from essentially where Bradshaw Road is today, all the way past Prairie City Road. He unfortunately died in 1848, shortly after the gold discovery. His mother, that Creole living in the West Indies, became the owner of that property. She later sold it for $70,000 to a man named Folsom, Captain Folsom of the American. That's a huge sum of money, $70,000. Until you find that they took out over $240 million worth of gold from that exact same land. This is John C. Fremont. John C. Fremont is, of course, known as the Pathfinder. He should really be called the Path Marker because there's nowhere that John C. Fremont went that Christopher Kit Carson did not take him. In 1846, Fremont was here in California for the second time. He had already mapped with the topographical color all of California in 1844. But in 1846, because he recognized there was weak government. He knew that California was ripe for rebellion. He knew that Sutter had a powerful location geographically and a powerful fortification. Fremont comes back largely as a spy, either a spy for the American army or possibly a spy for himself personally. He has with him 62 hardened mountain men, men that are pseudo soldiers. In fact, in order to join Fremont's expedition, you had to prove you could shoot. They had a shooting contest to see who would get to go with Fremont. He did have one topographical engineer with him, but that was all. But he is just filibustering around California, causing problems with the Mexican authorities, causing problems with the Indians along the Mokelumne River. He takes and raises the American flag for what happens to be the second time in California. Actually, a guy named Atsby Jones had raised it in 1841 or 42, but Fremont raises it over Gavilan Peak and then has to take it down when the Mexicans threaten him and sneak off in the dead of night back to Sutter's Fort. Kit Carson had been in and out of California many times. He has a daughter who's buried at Mono Lake, Adelaide Carson. And Carson, of course, is most famous for Carson Pass and a blaze that he supposedly put in a tree that was still preserved to this day in the Sutter's Fort Museum or out at McClellan Air Force Bay. They cut that out of the tree to preserve it when the tree died. Now, the only problem with that is it's dated 1846. Kit Carson did not sign a pay voucher until 1862. He couldn't write. So in that 1846 expedition, either Carson found somebody who could write, but there were only two people. One was John Fremont. I can assure you if Fremont was going to put somebody's name on a tree, it would be John Fremont. And the other was a guy named Charles Preuss, who, if you read his unauthorized biography, he hated Kit Carson. My thought is Carson came back later in the 1850s and either had someone else or someone told him how to memorialize that past. This is not Elvis, no matter what those mutton chops look like. This is Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. He was the most important man in California. He was the general in charge of the Mexican army. He was the best dancer. He was the best horseman. He was sometimes Sutter's friend, sometimes Sutter's enemy. He was in conflict with Sutter because they were neighbors. He had taken and fortified the old Sonoma mission, and there he had moved the Mexican army. This is how that barracks looked in about 1846. Still looks that way very much around that town square that is in Sonoma. But it was on June 12th, 1846, that a ragtag bunch of settlers, and not just Americans, there were Frenchmen, there were Germans, organized themselves primarily at Sutter's Fort and secondarily at Bales Mill, and they decided that they were going to declare California its own independent republic. Also, Fremont at this time was camped right below the Sutter Buttes and was there to act for them if something went wrong and the Mexicans were to counterattack. So in the pre-dawn hours of June 12, 1846, these men attacked the Mexican military headquarters at Sonoma and in one day conquered the entire Mexican army, the entire northern department of the Mexican army. Of course, they had to awaken them to tell them they were under attack, unfortunately. There were only 12 of them at this time. And that thus began the Bear Flag Republic. This is the original flag of the California Bear Flag Republic. It was created by William Todd, who just happened to be the nephew of Mary Todd Lincoln. At this time, Lincoln was a first-term congressman from Illinois, while his nephew was here making California free and independent. Now, on it, they put a single red star. That red star was done in honor of Texas. Texas had been the Lone Star Republic since the Revolution of 1836 when the Alamo was fought. But on December 28, 1845, Texas, against the treaty they had signed with Mexico, became part of the United States and became the 28th state. California was now going to be the new Lone Star Republic. And on it, they put a ferocious grizzly bear. Does that look like a ferocious grizzly bear to you guys? No, you know what it didn't to the people at Sonoma either. They looked at it and they said, oh, El Coyote, the boar. They thought it looked a lot more like a pig than it did like a bear. But it wouldn't be very popular to be from the Pig Flag Republic. And then finally, they put a red stripe across the bottom. The red stripe stood for the blood they were willing to shed to keep California free and independent. And this tells you a little bit about history. Now, many of you are probably familiar with H.H. Bancroft's History of California. It's 7 volumes of small print, all the details about California history. Now, he wrote that in the late 1870s, early 1880s. When he wrote it, he was able to interview people who participated in the Bear Flag Revolt. And he interviewed 6 different people. You know how many different stories he got? 7. Because William Todd told 2 different stories. But my favorite story about the red stripe that stood for the blood they were willing to shed is it came from the underwear of Uncle Billy Elliot, or William Bell Elliot. His wife provided the red stripe, and to get that, she had to cut up his long johns. And you talk about giving it all up for the rebellion. And that, my friends, concludes today's very first part of California history. Thank you very much for your participation. And I think I can turn it over for questioning now, huh? Are we about there? Is that right? Somebody else I don't remember what I'm supposed to do now.
You're gonna just hit the stop share button.
Stop the share button. There we go. Okay.
There you go. And then we'll bring Ruth in.
Okay.
And we're gonna add Ruth in.
Thank you. There are a lot of comments from people who are very impressed with your thoroughness, your depth of presentation, etc. So on behalf of all these comments, I'm saying a great many thanks. A question or two. You had mentioned that in 1850, was it after 16 years, he returned to his wife? So,
well, his wife returned to him.
Where were they living? She came out to California?
Yeah, she never lived at the fort. They went directly to Sutter's plantation on the Feather River, known as Hawk Farm. Hawk Farm was destroyed in a fire in 1865. Most remnants of it were destroyed in floods subsequent to that of the Feather River. I worked on some of the archaeology there. We were able to identify what had been the swine pen at one time, and that's all we were able to find. But that's part of part 2 of this presentation that goes after the Bear Flag Revolt. But Sutter opened a plantation on the Feather River that became a center for California agriculture. He was instrumental in starting the first California State Fair, which was then known as the California Agricultural Exposition. But Hawk Farm was a regular stop on the steamship ride from San Francisco to Marysville. You automatically stop there, not just because there were places to go to get off, but because it was a place where people gathered. It was kind of like the old nut tree used to be, if any of you remember that, as a halfway point or so. But it was he grew, to this day, they still, of course, grow a lot of peaches in Sutter County, but he developed a peach that became known worldwide as the John Sutter peach, because he was able to graft the peaches with a different peach that made them more resistant to drought and more resistant to the bugs of Northern California. He also brought the wine industry, essentially, or the grape industry, into the Central Valley. He had tried to plant Rhine grapes and Loire grapes, and they always failed. And of course, Vitis californica, the native grape, which, boy, his eyes must have lit up like saucers when he's sailing up that Sacramento River in 1839 in August, and those trees are just filled with grapevines everywhere, because Sutter knew how to make money on the frontier. The way he financed his trip to the Room River Mountain Rendezvous was by selling whiskey and liquor, and tobacco. So he knew liquor on the frontier is going to pay off. So he probably lit up like saucers when he sees, hey, all these grapes, I'll make wine, or I'll turn them into brandy. Unfortunately, you know who else harvests the grapes? The birds. And in order to harvest the grapes before the birds, you had to harvest them too early so that you didn't get enough sugar for the alcohol content necessary for the frontier palate or for the taste of those who wanted a finer wine. But what Sutter learned is that you could graft the Californicus with the European grapes and create varietal grapes, which essentially brought the wine and wine grape industry into the Central Valley. Did I answer the question? Dangerous to ask me a question.
And several people, and this is more of a rhetorical question, are saying, when is part two? But
that's not up to me.
You've
Although,
developed quite
I am available if you have an organization, a history organization or something like that. I'm happy to come out and speak to those.
And so another question which is posted is, how did you develop your interest, or the person said your fascination with Sutter?
Well, that was by accident, kind of. I've always been interested in history. I grew up largely in my grandparents' house, and that was in rural Kentucky. And my grandpa used to take me around in his old 51 Plymouth and show me this is where Boonesboro was, and this is what was here before they put the dam in, and this is where the only post office. And so just listening to his stories got me fascinated with hearing stories. Well, in 1967, when I was a sophomore in high school, I moved to Sacramento. I went to Rio Marcano High School and then to Sac State, and American River College. But yeah, so it was during that process of after I had already started becoming interested in Sacramento history and had been reading about it and what there was available to read of, like Fool's Gold, some of the early books about Sutter I had already read. But they advertised one day in the anthropology room at Sac State, the kind of the common room where all the anthropology people sit around and shoot the bull, that they were hiring for a summer position. And so I applied in 1996 for a summer position at Sutter's Fort, and by golly, I dressed in 3 layers of clothing and wore old-fashioned boots that hurt my feet miserably. And for 2 summers, I did summer interpretation of talking to visitors to the fort about what life was like in early California and shooting off a cannon and musket. But it was during that I realized that Sutter's Fort at that time housed the largest collection of original source Donner Party material anywhere in the world, anywhere in existence, and was in fact a large holding repository for lots of early California history. So I took another class, became an archivist, and learned to work the archives, and became interested in reading all of the original letters and diaries and documents. And it was in reading what the original people had to say that I became intensely interested. In fact, I'm an anthropology major, not a historian. It was never my intent to become history bound. It was to be an anthropologist. And frankly, I had a very negative view of Sutter when I first entered into the whole thing. I thought he was an enslaver and a bad guy. And that was the perspective with which I approached it until I studied it. And then I realized, by God, as an anthropologist, you can't apply an anthropological lens across time. Things are going to look different in 1900 than they looked in 2000, no matter what you do, or than they're going to look in 3000. Things we're doing now are going to be awful then, or maybe we've gone back or whatever, but you cannot apply an anthropological lens across time. All you can do is compare what people were like within their own time. How were they viewed? What did other people think of them? What was their respect? And frankly, there's a reason why over 250 different entities are named after John Sutter. My favorite story, real quick. So, the Sutter Club. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
As much as we would love to hear part 2 and more stories now, for better for worse, we do end pretty much at 4. Right. So I'm going to turn this back to, I think, Michelle, for a wrap up. And again, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure, you guys. Thanks for having me.
Mr. Beck, in appreciation for your thought-provoking presentation, you will receive an honorary membership in the Renaissance Society, as well as a donation in your name to the Seth Nelson Student Emergency Grant Fund. Thank you very much.
Anna, thank you. I didn't know that part. That's great. Glad to hear that.
Today's presentation was recorded and you can view it in two separate ways on the Renaissance Society Forum channel on YouTube or from the Renaissance website. We invite you to join us next Friday for another fascinating forum on the rise of the Chicano movement in Sacramento. Professor Lorena Marquez of the UC Davis Department of Chicano Studies will discuss her new book, The Hende, tracing the role of everyday people in contesting oppression in schools, work, and in their communities. Thank you for being with us today, and we hope to see you next Friday for another important aspect of Sacramento's